These are histories of the frontiers, not necessarily in historical order. We had a history of dealing with the Russians, which is sort of current history. We've had a history of German rocketry, which now we're going to talk about some history of the Apollo. Let's see. Ross Fleisig is a graduate aeronautical engineer, MS in Applied Mechanics from Polytechnic Review in Brooklyn. Worked for Chariots as an aerodynamicist for 8 years, 10 years at Ferry as an engineering sector head of flight controls, 23 years with Grumman as a project engineer on the Orbiting Astronomical Observatory, a project leader on the Apollo Lunar Module, the guidance and navigation control systems. Was a spacecraft team manager for Apollo 11, the lunar module number 5 that actually landed on the moon. Was responsible for the final assembly, integration, and ground test. He's been in the aerospace business for 12 years. Let's see. Ron Creel got into an engineering task fresh out of college at NASA, design, test verification, control system for the Apollo lunar roving vehicle. He was given the Silver Snoopy Award for his work. Some thermal engineering projects at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, including the Laser Geodynamic Satellite, the High Energy Astronomical Observatory, the X-ray calibration test facilities, and extensive thermal stress analytical work on the Space Shuttle main engine, internal flow components. Then he moved on to system engineering and technical assistance work for the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization. Yes. Now he's back engineering for lunar exploration and rovers. He's going to describe the L.E.M thermal design and support and share some lessons about coping with the harsh lunar environment. Dr. Charles Pellegrino, described by Steve as a space scientist who occasionally looks down. His interest includes oceans on icy moons in the outer solar system, DNA and prehistoric flies embedded in amber, antimatter rockets, the raising of the Titanic. He's the co-author of Chariots for Apollo, about the development of the Apollo lunar module, flying to Valhalla. Okay, they're going to talk about Apollo memories, and then there'll probably be a reasonably extended discussion period.
Yeah. What I'm going to show you today is half a dozen slides from a talk which I'm going to give in full detail on Sunday at 1 o'clock in room E. In 1961, I had spent some time, a year or two, on the Orbiting Astronomical Observatory at GRUM in Bethpage, helping to design the stabilization and control system for that vehicle. But later in 1961, the company decided to want to bid on the lunar module. And I joined the proposal team working in the area of performance and dynamic analysis, guidance and control. Oh, let's see. All right. Several of you, many of you in this room are old enough to remember the Apollo program. We flew men to the moon. On the left, you see a picture of the stack at pad 39B at Cape Kennedy. The first, second, and third stages go up to about 330 feet. And then at the top of the third stage, which is S4B, the Douglas stage, we have the Apollo spacecraft. On the right, I've blown up the Apollo spacecraft view, and we have 3 modules. The command module, which flew from launch to lunar orbit, and then brought the astronauts home from lunar orbit back to Earth. The service module carried the expendables. It was unmanned. It was always attached to the command module. And the lunar module then took the astronauts, after they transferred from the command module to the lunar module, down to the surface, housed the astronauts, 2 of the 3 astronauts, for the lunar stay, and then brought them back in the ascent stage to the command and service module. This is a sketch of a drawing of the lunar module. It's built in 2 stages, the ascent stage and the descent stage. The descent stage here has the landing gear, the tanks for the descent engine, the landing radar, and the bays around the descent stage would carry the experimental equipment. And my next speaker will tell you more about that. The ascent stage houses the 2 astronauts in a cabin. It has displays and controls and really all of the subsystems, ascent propulsion, communication subsystem, caution and warning, guidance, navigation, and control, do most of the maneuvering of the vehicle from the descent up to ascent. This is a drawing. If you can't see it there, it's more like an eye test. The weight of the total lunar module is 28,000 pounds with the propellant and the crew. Less the propellant and crew, the lunar module weighs 9,500 pounds. The size of the lunar module is 31 feet across the flats of the landing gear. So I'll give you an idea of the facilities. We had a considerable number of engineering test facilities at Grumman. This is the space simulator. All the equipment in the lunar module that was designed to withstand the space environment, the heat from the sun and the cold, in the absence of the sun on the other side. We could test an ascent or descent stage in this space simulator and check out the effectiveness and the reliability of the equipment in these environments. We spent a lot of time during the development period, which took from 1960, early 62 to up through most of 1965, in doing the development work. This consisted of studies, it consisted of tests, establishing specifications, subcontracting, putting subcontractors on board throughout the program. This, though, is the cabin, which was instrumented with the displays and controls. It had the computer, the guidance and navigation and control computer. It also had the flight controls, which the astronauts would operate to fly the lunar module, the ascent stage. We did a considerable amount of simulation, and this lasted for over 2 years. And some of it was done with astronauts, some of it was done with our own engineering personnel. We couldn't fire live engines. And remember, on the lunar module, we had 3 kinds of propulsion systems. The descent stage had a large, swivelable engine that TRW built, and that engine got us down in a retro thrust condition to get us down to the surface of the moon at 0 speed. The ascent engine took the astronauts off the moon in the ascent stage, and that was a very simple engine. It has fixed thrust and was not swivelable, and it was a constant amount of thrust. The reaction control system provided the ability of the L.E.M to be rotated, yaw, pitch, and roll, steer the vehicle. None of these engines could be fired in Bethpage on Long Island because of the safety conditions of nearby communities. So what NASA asked us to do was to build up a test facility at White Sands. There we constructed 3 chambers, 2 of which we could fly in almost zero vacuum conditions. And the third chamber was in an local ambient, which was around 5,000 feet. All of these engines were tested over a period of 2 to 3 years. Many runs were made. We got a lot of practical experience on engine performance. We got good experience on how the structure and the equipment in the Lunar module could withstand conditions when the engines were being fired, vibration and thrust conditions. As I say, this went on for 2 to 3 years and gave us considerable experience on reliability and performance for the engines. This is a picture of the Lunar module in the spacecraft assembly and test area in Bethpage. We had a room there about 300 yards long, about 100 yards wide, about 40 feet high, where we did this testing. It was an environmentally controlled room, and we control both temperature and humidity to keep the vehicle clean and to actually keep dust out of all the equipment as well as the cabin. This is a picture of line number 5. This was the vehicle I was responsible for in Bethpage. We're doing the final assembly, integration of hardware, and testing on this vehicle. The vehicle is complete. It doesn't have the thermal shield on it. Otherwise, it's a complete vehicle. In this picture, it was being weighed to get the official weight of the vehicle. And that indicates as much information as I wanted to present today about the LEM. I might add that we built LEM 5, the lunar module, which actually was the first lunar lander, in 1960, late 67, all of 1968, and it was completed in December of 68. The descent stage was flown in a Super Guppy to Cape Kennedy, and the ascent stage was flown for a month later in a Super Guppy. I went down to the Cape and I helped with the mating of LEM number 5 with the command and service module. It was a wonderful experience. I might mention that the whole team, which consisted up to 8,000 people at its peak, this included 1,000 to 3,000 engineers, scientists, and technical support people, were very enthused about the job we were doing. They were dedicated, and the hard work that we put in led to some wonderful flights. I think that we'll save the questions till later. Okay. Mr. Creel.
Thank you very much, Ross. Before I show a couple of slides about the Rover, I wanted to make a couple of comments. When I went to Huntsville, I started co-oping there, my co-op days before college, and I did work on the Saturn V, and that certainly, we talked before about a few thousands of pounds of thrust. I remember as a co-op student there saying, hey, let's go outside here and they're going to fire the first firing of the Saturn V first stage rocket motors, which a total thrust of 7.5 million pounds of thrust. And that literally shook the windows, and I knew that we were into something serious at that time. That was in circa about 65, 66. And y'all have all seen the final results of Saturn V. Unfortunately, we don't have a video. I was going to show a Saturn V launch today, but you've seen Apollo 13 lately, and they did a good job of it. I wish we'd have had IMAX back in those days, because I've seen the shuttle movies. I'd like to have seen a Saturn V on IMAX movie as a remembrance. A couple other comments about when I was working on Saturn V, I did work on POGO. The very first thing as a co-op student was POGO. I remember we had strip charts and a thing called a Gerber scale. Now, a lot of these young engineers here will never get to use a Gerber scale, but that was our device for scaling data. And computers were, we literally had Marchant calculators, but it was a great big deal when the Hewlett-Packard 35 came out. Everybody had to buy one of those. They were about $400. And you get them cheaper, about $320 or so, but still, that was a big deal, was a Hewlett-Packard 35. So and another big deal was a PDP-8, a digital PDP-8 computer with paper tape. So we get back. Even during mission control. Now tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to have 5 or 6 more detailed stuff, talk about the Lunar Rover and mission support. But I will tell you, during mission support, we had a 32-bit computer downstairs that we used that was shared for the displays. But we also had the input for it was a teletype. There's a lot here in the future that can be done here with PCs and Pentium processors and Pro Pentiums, all that. We kind of struggled along back then. We had to do an awful lot of work ahead of time and work out a whole lot of curves and contingency cases. I think I now make a few comments about the rover, show a couple of charts. These are all kind of things y'all can ask about later. I show here, this was out of a weekly reader type that I used to get as a kid. This is circa 1960. This is literally, we get every week, and they talk about advances in science. Okay. Okay, let y'all adjust there. And this is a very unique rover. See single stage to orbit or landing rocket craft, which you see. But I thought it was really like a hamster type device for a self-propelled moonaut. I just discovered that in my records recently, and I thought I'd throw it in there. That's an early lunar mobility concept. Certainly, to follow off on what Ross said, we did. Sorry, get it on there. We did finally develop a rover and get it to the moon. I want to try to point out here that in designing a rover, we were subject to the transportation phase of getting out there and to dealing also with having to fold it up into a very compact package. It weighed about a little over 480 to 500 pounds, the rover itself, but it carried more than twice that amount of weight in payload, astronauts, backpacks, science equipment on the back end. So, and then lunar samples, we even had lunar, underneath the seats, they had, you wonder yourself, where did they put the rocks? Well, it was under the seats. Every bit of spare space was utilized if it could be. So that's how they carried the rocks back on each sortie. And one thing I want to also point out here too is you can't get too automatic. We started in with the deployment sequence, trying to make it real automatic. Well, look like they push one button. That doesn't work. The dynamics of something like this unfolding, we also tried to do 1/6 gravity test. It didn't work, so we finally came down to a system that used 2 reels of tape that the astronauts would each use on each side, and they would slowly pull on them and go through each individual section of the deployment and verify that, hey, indeed, these have flopped out this way. And then if you come down, the front wheels hit the ground. It took about 25-30 minutes to get it deployed, but we want to make darn sure that we did get it deployed. And that's the point, that make some things automatic. In this case, we actually used the astronauts to help. And as you can see, we finally did get the rovers deployed. In fact, even on Apollo 17, they had the saddle, which is up in this area right up in here. You can't see it right there. The saddle grabbed on them, and the astronauts were able to bang it loose. That's good. And this is the rover as we got it onto the moon. This is actually on another page, so it talks a little bit about dust. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But you can see it was about 10 foot long and about a little less than 4 foot in height. As I said, weighed a little under 500 pounds. And I carried a good deal of equipment along aboard in that we were able to carry a high gain antenna and a TV camera out along the sorties. They weren't able to use the TV camera during much of the motion because the high gain antenna had to be pointed right at the Earth. But there are some movies that you can see, some videotapes that show some of the traverse. But it was mainly for once they got out to a site to be able to use the TV camera and the back room did make some changes in the astronauts' plans based upon looking at different things. And I remember on Apollo 17, the most interesting thing was orange soil. When Harrison Smith found orange soil, he almost had to prove it to the folks. Said, hey, turn the TV camera over here, we're going to show this. So he did show the orange soil, which is glass beads actually. It wasn't really soil as much as glass beads. And as you see on the back end is a goodly amount of equipment we carried along, and a pallet was stored on board the lunar module. And the astronauts had a T-shaped hand controller with Ackerman steering. They had dual Ackerman steering, which means that the wheels turn in a very tight radius. And you could do crab steering, but they found that was uncomfortable. We had occasion also that on various missions, on Apollo 15, the front steering didn't work on the first EVA, but when they came back out, they flipped a few switches a different way and cured that problem. Had a lot of flexibility in the console I'll talk about tomorrow. And also, there was also a good amount of testing that went on, even 1/6 gravity testing like you saw for the development of Apollo 13. They did actually, the crew ingress and egress. They did work on that on the KC-135 on a small model. I'm kind of telling you some things were on the video that you won't be able to see today. But an awful lot of testing went into this vehicle. And to get a time frame, as Ross had given, from the summer of '69, the contract was awarded late summer, well, maybe September of '69. Actually delivered, Boeing was the main contractor, delivered the first flight qualified rover in about 17, 18 months. In addition to that, they built a total of 4. The program was canceled. Apollos 18 and 19 were canceled along the way. Of course, Apollo 20 was canceled even earlier than that. And so we built 4 full flight rovers, and they've been through all the qualification, thermal vacuum testing, vibration, full set of tests. There was also a 1G trainer that was built for the astronauts to train on down at Cape Canaveral. And other rovers built for testing out in the desert. Those were done by the Manned Spacecraft Center. I'll show you quickly a couple other charts on what I primarily worked on. I primarily worked on the thermal control system up in the front end. And this picture on the left shows the covers raised. We used space radiators, and we used fusible mass tanks, wax boxes, to store heat during drives. We also used some very innovative thermal straps we designed. And this is all tested separately. And then this is a blow-up showing the different thermal control components. I'll discuss it in a little more detail tomorrow. It all had to be designed so that it would preclude being affected by the dust. We'll talk about dust a little tomorrow also. This shows a pretty good breakdown of the level of testing. In that we actually built a dynamometer type test over here at an angle to simulate the 1/6 gravity. Had a rover on there and had bumps. And the rover, they would slide back and forth across those bumps. Had the dynamometer rotating. Interesting about the dynamometer, problem we had was they had designed the heat exchanger in there for the motor. We had to pull it back out and put a water tube type heat exchanger on the motor for the drive system. No trouble operating on the moon, trouble operating on Earth. And it also has a plate here, simulates solar load added on. And this shows the full-up rover at an angle test. We had a certain angle requirement to meet climbing capability. With this cone, people probably ask what's that cone? That's for electromagnetic interference testing for the TV equipment. And various subsystem tests using a tub to simulate the hot moon for the forward chassis test. Trying to give you all a short briefing here on what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. Certainly, what's been written about the rover is that this pushed the level of technology on basic land locomotion interaction testing and data. The folks helped us down at Waterways Experiment Station, Corps of Engineers, and Dr. Becker from University of Michigan. They devised testing methods, collected an awful lot of data on the basic locomotion, and what's the basic interaction between the wheel and the soil, and what kind of losses do you have, and what's required as far as motors. I should point out earlier, the 4 motors are only a 1/4 horsepower each, so it's only a total of 1 horsepower device, and went about 10 miles an hour at the max speed. Turns out you don't want to go too fast on the moon, because you have a whole lot, you can have a whole lot of rough terrain. Here's I don't know if it's Commander Scott or Mr. Irwin. They had a coded system. I don't know if you can read it. He's got a red stripe that would be the commander. It is commander? Okay. I sort of see a stripe over there. And so this was our goal. We finally met, was getting the Apollo 15 on the moon. We did have 3 rovers, Apollo 15, 16, and 17. Minor anomalies along the way, but certainly very successful. Now you can see here, I can see in the original pictures, the left front fender extension was knocked off. The crewman never said a word about it. We got all the way back down here to Earth and figured that out later. And it turns out on Apollo 16 and 17, they decided to put the little hammer in a little pocket on the foot, on their arm, on their leg. Well, Murphy's Law, they proceeded, both commanders proceeded to tear off the fender extension on Apollo 16 and 17. And it was interesting, you asked the question, well, if you did on Apollo 16, why couldn't we get them to not do that on Apollo 17? Well, you didn't always get, if they had a requirement, they could try to kind of treat the rover as if it worked good, and they, in certain ways, they jump. You can't put too many constraints on. Hey, they were jumping around and moving around, and really, I'll put the blame back on us for having a fender extension that could be knocked off, I guess. But it had to be on there because of the way the rover was folded up. And I'll show you a couple more quick ones here about, I call these tracks in the snow. And these tend to show the variability of the lunar soil. I think they're very interesting in that respect. And then that shows the smooth Mare up in the left corner, somewhat coarser. These are all Apollo 15. And then down to boulder fields that they had to dodge through. They Crewmen got to this reel. The mission went to what's called a Hadley Reel, and they had a lot of trouble there. The crewmen really wanted to go down into that reel. They really wanted to get, but we were worried more that they wouldn't be able to get the rover back up. I should mention at certain times, the rover did get caught in some craters, and they would get off and would literally lift it up, take it back out. It was light, figure 480 divided by 6, it only weighed, 75 pounds or so. And this is some more pictures from the moon showing different aspects. This is trying to show difference in the texture of the soil. You can see the tracks of the rover here. In fact, on a couple missions, they said that they, even though it had a navigation system on that gave them dead reckoning back to the lunar module, that they could still track back using the path on the way out. And it's pretty thick stuff here, probably 7-8 inches thick, loose, very loose material there. And finally, what you'll hear tomorrow, or here today too, we did cope with the dust, but certainly looking back here, once we had opened the covers the first time, this is a heating up period, driving, and then a cool down period. We didn't even get the amount of cooling we wanted to get for the first periods, but certainly after opening up the covers and then brushing the radiators, we on all 3 missions had a whole lot of trouble on the second cool down, and effectively got no effective cool down. So that's what the story is on the thermal control system. And we even had to go to some means of switching power and to actually open covers during EVAs. It was not the plan usually to do them during EVA. It's planned to do them during a nighttime period. Just before they left the rover, they go back into the lunar module, they would open the covers. Let me say one other comment about the astronauts up here. I really respected these gentlemen, and we worked with them very closely through all the missions. I'm going to present a couple of questions. One comment about Apollo memories, and I can't get this across to my kids. And it did strike me. We had on Apollo 16, the batteries ran hot. It was partly also because we started providing all the power for the TV system off the rover batteries. This saved and meant the astronauts didn't have to carry the batteries out there to the rover and spend that time putting the batteries in. They just flick a switch. We provided all the power for the TV unit. It helped us run a little bit hotter, and also, but in combination with that, they called us down to the crew quarters after Apollo 16. And at the time, the memory that I have is that it didn't strike me as being all that. You go in there, they're in quarantine for the last few months before the launch. And you go into their quarters, it wasn't all that fancy a place, really. We literally sat down there. It did strike me till I was on the airplane coming back that I had been in the room there and shook hands and talked to 2 men that had been in the backup crew and 2 men that were going. Now that was overpowering for me at the time, and still in retrospect, thinking back, it was quite a memory from Apollo. When I convey this to my kids, there's no way to, I show them the pictures and the books and autographs or whatever. I put on today my Apollo 11, got buzzed to sign at the meeting out in San Diego back in November, the mission badge, so I carry some memories. They were good memories, and we'll be ready to hear some questions. I have a question that posed to y'all later, but I appreciate being here, and I hope I've shared a few ideas and a few thoughts from the way it was back, coming up now 25 years ago for Apollo 15. So I think next up is Charles Pellegrino. He's going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to throw it out to y'all and pose a couple of questions. Here's Charles.
It's rather odd how distance of 25 years or so really changes the view of something. Finally, we've had the movie Apollo 13, which I think for the first time conveyed to most of the public, it's strange little snipes against Grumman aside, but basically conveyed to the public that, gee, exciting things were happening during the moon missions, that this wasn't a boring time, that fantastic things were going on at one time, and gee, it was kind of dramatic, wasn't it? Give you an idea how history how distance can change things, and sometimes it does take something like Apollo 13, the movie, to wake people up a little bit. It even happened with the Titanic. It wasn't a very big event 10 years after it happened. Then in the late 1950s, there was Walter Lord's movie, A Night to Remember, and the Titanic has been a very big thing ever since. And but going back about 1982, 1983, when Josh Stoff and I were going around talking to people like Ross Fleisig and George Scurll at Grumman and putting together this book, Chariots for Apollo, which had the great bad timing of about a month after it came out, no, 2 weeks after it came out, it was selling completely out. Newsday gave it a review in which they said this book is too much of a grand hooray for Grumman and NASA, and then the Challenger exploded. And the publisher canceled the second printing and said, well, this is no time to be going into a book about the Apollo moon landings and about 3 men almost suffocating in space, and especially a book that's too much of a grand hooray for Grumman and NASA after they blew up their ship. And the guy said, and besides, who's really interested in space anyway? Glad to say the book is going to be coming out in a new edition. And I have to talk with, you know, the part afterward, where are they today? I have to talk with you guys about where the space program has come in the last 25 years and the depressing things about where it is and where it's going or not going lately, and where we all wish it would go. Odd thing, back at that time, 1983 approximately, Grumman had opened up all of its records, all of its files. We were even allowed to dissect parts of an old half-constructed lunar module to see how the chem milling process had been done, and this incredibly thin hull material. I mean, parts of the hull of the lunar module were as thick as 2 sheets of newspaper. I was stunned to see this, and because conserving mass on the ship was that important, that whole scrape and SWIP program, and it was just an amazing engineering feat when you get right down to it. It's still, to me, about the most amazing spacecraft that's ever been built. And then you have the Saturn rocket. But oddly enough, at that time, the guy I'm working with on all this, he's going for a doctorate at a rather large university that'll remain nameless, Stony Brook. And one of the professors says, why are you wasting your time on this? The moon landings are not history. I've got news for that professor. 1,000 years from now, when people look back to this millennium, this is what they're going to remember. Because this, assuming civilization lasts that long, this will be the first stepping stone to where we will be then. Or if civilization doesn't last that long, there'll be a few people sitting around in front of log cabins talking about, gee, this as one of the biggest symbols of another lost Eden or lost Atlantis legend. One of the things in talking with Ross Fleisig and the other people who worked on the lunar module was seeing that almost every one of them, and a lot of these people had worked on military programs and on some very important aircraft, and you never saw a section of a room that was a shrine to some bomb or even to the F-14 or the aircraft carrier planes that were used in World War II. Always there was a little shrine, and I didn't find one exception. It was almost as if in some part of a room in the house there was a shrine to Apollo. and little bits of Apollo memorabilia, and there was not one exception. This was the one thing that these guys were all most proud of. And I'm proud of them all too, to this day. And like to look at, gee, I did mention something about, gee, you know, where is the future of the moon? Well, it was a very expensive thing getting there the first time. It was expensive in lives of not just the Apollo 1 astronauts, but in the lives even of the people who built the lunar module. Some died from exhaustion. It was, until looking into the story, never having heard so many people say that they went 3 or 4 years without once having dinner with their families. People who said they missed their children growing up. I mean, this was the kind of dedication that went into this goal of opening up, throwing open the doors to that new wilderness. And we went through something similar with Antarctica. Well, 40, 50 years later, people went back to Antarctica when it was not so expensive to do so. And when they went back, they went to stay. And I think this is what we're going to see on the moon. And the moon is a tremendous resource. There's some deuterium, tritium up there in the lunar soil that comes off from the solar atmosphere and has been gathering there for about 4.5 billion years. And that can be used, but more importantly, it's a place for some really nice industrial projects, something called the Asimov array. In about 20, 30, 40 years, we will have self-replicating robots, and the technology for self-replicating robots is going to be somewhat like the invention of fire. It's going to be something that allows engineering projects cheaply that are unthinkable now. For instance, covering large parts of the moon's equator with a ring of solar panels that of course will be narrow enough so that this interrupted array is not visible with the unaided eye from Earth. We don't want to take the romance out of the moon, but we're talking about then being able to get from the moon more power production than is produced by all the power plants on Earth today. Now, much of that power we can beam down to Earth, and I don't think that's going to happen if we're the same kind of civilization today, because you'd have to worry about who's going to control that microwave laser. As tempting as it is to swing it in Saddam's direction or Gaddafi's direction. But if the world has to worry about people doing things like that, they're not going to build the thing. Also, okay, we have self-replicating robots that build self-replicating robots that build solar panels. And this is something that will cost the initial investment of those first 30 machines or so that you put on the moon. They get to a critical population density and then they stop. And then they build the solar panels. And it's like a viral infection for the moon. Later for the planet Mercury, when we really need a lot of power to make tons of anti-hydrogen. Middle of the next century, if we're still a together civilization, middle of the next century, we have starships going out. No, not like a big enterprise thing. We're talking about small, ultralight starships, tether systems, the Valkyrie, carrying crews of maybe 2 people. But the first expeditions to other stars. This is something that is probably coming within the lifetimes of many of the children who are walking the earth today. So just a little glimpse of some of the future. What you do, you have the solar panels, and then you have the little tabletop linear accelerators also built by self-replicating machines and anti-hydrogen, the ultimate fuel. Great-grandchild of the system used in the lunar module called hypergolic propellants. Put 2 things together that hate the looks of each other, and you can go pretty far. Only with antimatter and matter, you're talking about things that hate the looks of each other over 10,000 times more than chemical propellants. Okay, so on that note, who's going to take the first questions? And
Why don't you guys
sit on the panel.
Okay.
Repeat the questions back to the audience. That seems to be a useful thing.
Right.
Charles had the basis of the first question I had was it really different back then? Maybe y'all can share about anybody that was on the program back then. That's the thing. The second part of that question I have is, are we presently today fighting virtual reality? Are we living in a virtually real world? You watch Captain Janeway or something on TV. Have we gone too far in that direction? That was questions I had, or maybe have Ross want to comment, I think, about the old days. And the first question, was it really different back then? Or what was different back then?
Yes, I think it was different. First of all, we had a mandate from the President of the United States that everybody took seriously. The backdrop for that was that the Russians had launched Sputnik and seemed to be doing things in the late 60s faster and better than we could do. And part of the reason for that was that they took the German ballistic missile, which a previous speaker spoke about, and made a space vehicle out of it very quickly. It was very big, it was cumbersome, it was not very accurate. Meanwhile, in the United States, what we were doing was a carefully crafted ballistic missile program, much more accurate and much more efficient. And they were ready for space before we were. With that backdrop, when President Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon, there was a lot of enthusiasm, there was a lot of support, there was patriotic pride behind it. I think that's really the reason Apollo started. And there's a tremendous amount of vigor in the program. Most of the workers at Grumman were very willing to work 60 or 70 hours a week to get the vehicle on time. Schedule was really the big thing then. We wanted to do the moon project before 1970, and so there was a lot of effort and vigor behind the program, and we don't seem to have that today. Right now, the problem is cost, not schedule, and it puts a different light on things in view of our country's finances. At least that's my answer.
One little note on how perceptions change with time, going back to about 1983 again. There was one person who was somewhat involved in the book, I remember just before it came out, who kind of wished that Chariots for Apollo wouldn't be put out there at all. Felt that it had made Grumman and NASA look kind of stupid, and said, you know, how dare you put an American flag on the cover of that book when you skipped over our triumph of Apollo 11 and focused on the mission that failed, Apollo 13. Unfortunately, another man from Grumman, who was a vice president at the time down at the Kennedy Space Center part of Grumman, stepped in and said, what do you mean our failure? Apollo 13 was the lunar module's trial by fire. It was our greatest moment in the space program. It proved that the ship really did work. And that man was Fred Hayes.
I met him.
Maybe the audience has either answers or questions also, or will entertain any questions. Yes?
In the early days, weren't we experimenting with more volatile fuels than the Russians?
The question is, in the early days, weren't we experimenting with more volatile fuels than the Russians? I'm not really an expert on fuels.
Well, the Navy had a Vanguard rocket that I think failed, but it was an early version of it.
I think Vanguard was not too different fuel, though, than the others. I mean, basically, Constance pointed out earlier, the real pioneer of space was Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, and the basic rocket equation has proven to be true and still true. Volatile in dangerous category, is that what you mean?
More energy, more punch.
More energy? I don't think so myself, but I know that some work in slush hydrogen, those things was attempted early back on, What the Russians were doing, I share with y'all, and I think we definitely were not. I couldn't get people to tell me what they were doing up in Tullahoma, Tennessee, at the Air Force facility, and I was very surprised myself. And people may be surprised here to know that the largest vacuum chamber, man-rated vacuum chamber in the free world, is not in Houston, Texas. It's in Tullahoma, Tennessee. The Air Force had it for the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program. This is an example, though, of we couldn't get cooperation from the Air Force and the Home Defense Department when we were doing the Apollo program. I didn't think myself. Ross might share his feelings there, but much less the Russians. And one day I was sitting there, we were in this fall of 71, we already done Apollo 15, and then fall of 71, this document appears on my desk, a translation about the Russian rover. And I wondered, you know, hey, how did they do things? And here was and it was a very rare document. You ever see that back in those days? That's a kind of input to y'all that, yes, we do have this ecumenism now, but back in those days, we didn't have it with the Russians, didn't have it with our own Air Force. And, but doesn't answer your question. I don't know much beyond slush hydrogen and as far as more powerful fuels. I think we saw him earlier. The chemical-based rockets, I don't think the promised savior is there myself.
In the back, yes. The last person.
Okay, what would you do differently if you were working today with today's technology in designing and building the lunar module and the rover?
Well, to repeat the question, what would we do differently today if we had to design Apollo lunar module or the rover? And I can think of two things immediately. We'd certainly gain by using modern electronics. The machines are smaller, they're much more accurate, and that you need less power to get the same performance. That's in one area. Now, you don't gain a lot of weight because the electronics was not a large fraction of the total lunar module weight. However, if you go to the structures area, we have skis and tennis rackets that are made out of modern materials. And to me, we could save a lot of weight there, and we could gain a great deal of strength from using epoxy and other types of modern materials. Those are the two areas where I think things would be different.
On the rover, what you'll hear tomorrow is that we did have to cope with the lunar dust, and we went with a minimum astronaut interface system. We would have gone with absolutely zero interface. We would have used an ammonia boiler. We just at the time didn't have, we had two things. We didn't at the time have the weight. We thought we couldn't get the weight down. We had a weight bogey to go against. And we had the other aspect that we were a little falsely led to believe that you could clean the dust off of radiators better. There was Earth-based tests, and that's a lesson learned, that Earth-based tests were totally false in that particular area about being able to clean off the radiators. So in retrospect, we would have gone to a totally sealed up a boiler type system. And we also felt guilty. The brushing they had to do and opening the covers and those things, we did really feel that was not science time. As we went along, we felt guilty about that, but it was what we had to do at the time.
You mentioned lunar dust. I can share a story that really wasn't publicized very well at the time. At least the media didn't pick it up. A famous astronomer from a northeastern university came down to Grumman and said that those landing pads, which at the time were about 8 to 10 inches diameter, aren't going to support the LEM on the moon. You're going to sink into 32 feet of dust. And this really shook up NASA, mainly the Johnson Space Center, the science people there, and it concerned our structural people too, about if this were true, it's going to be a real problem. It turned out that after the LEM-5 landed on the moon, the first lunar lander, it was no more than a half an inch to an inch of dust. Now, on later flights, we had more deeper dust levels, but never more than 3 or 4 or 5 inches. Nothing like the 32 feet that was predicted by the astronomer. Are there other questions? Yes, here in front.
Yeah, I think question is for Charles, but Ross, you might comment if you remember it. In Charles, your book, and I've never seen it published anywhere else or any discussion of it. You talk about on L.E.M 5, Apollo 11, inside the Mesa, that Grumman had a poster or some sort that Neil Armstrong seen, and then it was like hushed up by the press, and I've never heard anybody else
Right,
comment
where
on it.
Philemon Cupsid had written a message to the astronauts, a very friendly message to them, and then the story got out when someone had mentioned it in a pub, and General Rocco Petrone called them all in and was really, and then basically sent George Skurler out to rip a few heads off, but he was able to convince Petrone, please don't fire these guys, they're getting better with each lunar module. But it was forbidden to, absolutely forbidden to put anything on the L.E.M, to touch it in a way that you weren't supposed to. One of the more touching stories to me about the lunar module is George Skurler and I forget the other fellow's name who did it with him. They did it all proper and everything, sterile gloves, but they felt almost a superstitious need or whatever to kiss the L.E.M goodbye before every launch. And they would do it through a sheet of mylar so that their actual lips never really touched the L.E.M, and it became almost like a religious ritual when it was done with every one of them.
I'll share a memory of Dr. Petrone. Boy, when he led a flight readiness review, that was a site where a room filled as big as this or bigger with a number of engineers there. So you had to have your backup people there. There weren't that many presenters. You had your backup people all in the same room there because, and the other idea thing was that on one of the missions, one of the astronauts kicked a plug out on one of the instruments. I don't remember which one it was, but which instrument. But boy, you better believe that what had happened, they had made a change late in the sequence on that particular plug, and they never run it through astronauts training around it and jumping around. And Murphy's Law tells you, I guess, that indeed the astronaut kicked it loose. It wasn't the astronaut's fault, but it was the fault of the people, and you better believe that heads rolled after that. And so that's probably a good stop point. Yes, question?
Oh yeah, are you talking about on Apollo 11, the switch to the APS broke off? Is that what you're talking about?
No, there was on the moon, there was an instrument that they were jumping.
Oh, John, yeah, when he
moving around, it may have been John.
Oh, John,
I
he pulled the wire off the heat flow experiment.
Right, and they went back in, they tried to do a workaround, you took it back inside and tried to work it around, but it just was, it's a lesson learned there that, hey, somebody had changed that design or hadn't put it through the full workout of testing, and Dr. Petrone, he really used that one as a alert across the board, everyone, hey, is there something you haven't done here? And the question he'd ask at the meetings was, well, tell me that you've done that. You tell me you've done that. Well, tell me that your people have done that. You tell me. That's the management style we talked about a little outside earlier, that it was his responsibility, he felt, and he passed that along to you, the worker, too.
Are you speaking, I read someplace that on Apollo 11, the switch to the APS broke off, and then they had to use, I think, a ballpoint pen to activate it. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, that was where, with the backpack, one of the astronauts, I think it was Neil Armstrong, backed up and broke the switch. And they said, okay, go out for your walk. Basically, it was their ignition switch. Go out for your walk, guys. We'll work on it here. And I think Armstrong was going to stick his pen in there, but they found another way. They said, no, we don't want you to do that. We'll find another way to do it. Go out for your walk. There's another little-known story, and what was brought up about Thomas Gold and his theory that there could be a lot of dust there loosely packed, and ships could sink down into it unless they had what turned out to be widely said to be over-designed landing legs. And of course, Thomas Gold, he's been so right about so many other creepy things that when he comes up with a creepy idea, 8 out of 10 times you better listen. And you don't take anything he says for granted. And as it turned out, on Apollo 11, they did have a slug of fuel that was frozen in the line, and they were worried about the pressure building up, and there was a really, right after landing, they were worried, could this cause a buildup of pressure that could go off like a hand grenade in the descent stage and then damage the ascent stage engine. And so they came down to what they were probably going to do before the problem cleared itself, was burn the engine, just boom, and start the engine, and this might pop the LEM up off the moon's surface at some odd angle, and suddenly those over-designed LEM legs, where some people had said later on, who didn't know about this crisis that was building, that, gee, you know, you could have used helicopter skids is all you needed. But suddenly these over-designed LEM legs would have been very useful if you had had to pop the LEM up that way. And I think if we built a lunar module today, we probably would still have very wide legs in case you just came down at some odd angle a bit hard.
Tommy Gold is also the guy who said that we had a steady state universe. And he wasn't exactly right about that one.
No one's right all the time.
Also, he's the one that named the Big Bang theory, the Big Bang, because he thought that would be a derisive enough term that it would wipe it out of existence.
To go back to the story about the frozen fuel in the line leading from the descent tank to the engine, it took about 10 minutes for the pressure in that section of the line to relieve itself. And in those 10 minutes was a lot of concern, mainly at the Flight Control Center in Houston, because there were some NASA people that wanted to abort the mission and turn on the ascent engine and separate and go back to lunar orbit. But luckily, before that final decision was made, the pressure was relieved. And meanwhile, I don't think the astronauts, as well as I can recall, knew about what this was happening. This discussion took place back on Earth. It wasn't known because the instrument that measured that pressure was not on the LEM. It was being radioed back. Is there any other questions? Yes, one back there.
In terms of like for future launch capacities, is there anybody looking back at the old Saturn J engines for a resurrected use?
As far as I know, much of the engineering data that was used to manufacture all of the booster 3 stages and the spacecraft 3 modules no longer exists. It could not be replicated today. It'd start from scratch. Is that your feeling too?
Yeah, in other words, we can't build anything as good today.
It's not, no, I wouldn't say we can't build anything as good. We can't build it the same way. If we started from scratch, I'm sure we could do it better. Yes?
You're telling me we can't build the F1 engines again?
We don't have the same detailed design data to do it. We could probably work something up if we had to. It would be expensive. Yeah.
Has all the data been lost? I mean, all the blueprints and the plans?
As near as I can tell, I can speak just for the case of L.E.M. All the data was requested by NASA, and it was sent to Houston. What state it's in now, I really don't know. Yes?
Just to answer one quick question, there were, in fact, I believe 4 or 5 J2 engines in bonded storage at Huntsville. They have recently, in the last 6 months, have been brought out of bonded storage. Some of the turbopump machinery has been requested by Lockheed Martin for their X-33 derivatives of their Aerospike design.
Okay.
But those were in bonded storage, and in fact, I believe down at Michoud there are a couple F1s in bonded storage. The only other question that I was going to make is if, in fact, the gentleman mentioned that there were 4 flight rovers built. I've seen some of the prototype ground ones, but where is the final 4th?
It turns out the arrangement with the government is that the Smithsonian has first claim on all space. The 4th rover is, I think I've seen it at Smithsonian. I don't think it's presently out there. Is it in the gallery now? It's been off on, and in Huntsville, the Qual unit, which was literally the same unit as in Huntsville, that's where those 2 are. And the other programs were canceled. We never built a 5th one because the program had been canceled. What's the previous name? the next question. I'll think about what I lost.
I'd like to first off put in a plug for the Internet News Group, Sci-Space Tech, and secondly, the question of can you build a Saturn V has been talked about enough that it's in the frequently asked questions section, the FAQ. It turns out that all the blueprints are there, all the detail stuff is there. However, there were a lot of tradecraft, skillcraft issues in how you did things back in the 60s that would make it hard to do the Saturn V. On the other hand, the production line for the main engine for the Atlas was restarted after about 20 years, and Rockwell was looking at restarting the line for the F1 at the time of the Space Exploration Initiative. They could probably restart the lines for the F1 and the J2 or the J2S, just like they did it for the Atlas.
That's a very good comment. You provoked my answer to the one I forgot. You talked about old engines. When I was working on Star Wars, we were going to do a space-based liquid propulsion experiment, see what a liquid motor looked like from observing satellites. And we found that there were 3 of those old TRW lunar descent engines. Actually took one to Tullahoma and did some firings there. And so yes, you can, but we found that's a good lesson there. That we did find that the price tag was a lot higher because to reactivate that cell there at Tullahoma took a little more money to do that particular engine. But they did it. That's an example of we did take an old lunar module engine and use it. Next question? Back there.
What design considerations were made due to the time pressures of the project? Design considerations made due to time pressure that you would do differently having had more time.
Time was there. The clock was ticking. That's a very good question. He was asking what kind of time pressures. The clock was ticking. The challenge was in this decade, and definitely, and the pressure was on there. But certain fortuitous things did happen. If you read the history, I'd encourage you to read a book. They used to give us free books at NASA. The one, Apollo Expeditions to the Moon, is a very good book that gives several different chapters and different views on Portwright and others about from Dr. Von Braun. The certain fortuitous things, I think to myself, one of the major battle that took place that was won was about the whole translunar injection type method, the orbiting Earth, the low Earth orbit, and then going out to the moon, orbiting the moon. That, just as the shuttle had its own arguments about the delta wing and such, that was a major milestone to get past that argument about how were you going to do the mission. That was early on, was a major milestone that helped. That was a good decision, very good decision that was made. And others, maybe it was a little luck, more perseverance, but I think you saw the final result.
I'd like to share on that question too. Schedule was the all-important thing, as I mentioned before, and all of our LEMs were very, very carefully scheduled. Instead of calling it milestones on each LEM, we actually call it inchstones. And each spacecraft team manager who had a LEM was responsible for a LEM in terms of final assembly, integration, and test. He had an 8 o'clock meeting with senior management on the LEM program and the corporate offices to explain where he stood on his schedule. And his schedule was sacrosanct. He had to make that schedule. He had to work around. In the spacecraft assembly and test area, we could build as many as 3 LEMs at a time. We worked 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. I started working from 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock at night, every day. And I had a team, I had a deputy who worked from 7 p.m. at night, 7 a.m. in the morning. Later on, when we got more people, we had 3 8-hour shifts instead of 2 12-hour shifts. We worked every day of the week. This was to keep on schedule. We needed to do that to keep on schedule. And we needed to keep our management advised where the problems were. The 8 o'clock meeting, it lasted just a half hour. We had to explain where we were on the schedule, what operations were completed, what we were going to do about the ones we didn't complete. And if we needed help, that was the time to bring it up. We had the captains there to help us out and bring on new personnel and new resources if we needed it.
I had one other thought about milestones along the way. You'll notice a lot of flexibility in the schedule and some courageous men that made certain decisions when they didn't have the lunar module quite ready for Apollo 8. Apollo 8 did not fly a lunar module out there. That was a great, considering the S4B, the third stage, had never, to have the relight of that engine in Earth orbit to kick you off to the moon, that was certainly a milestone. Apollo 8 should not be forgotten, and the bravery and then the work around the schedule was the key point there. Working around, since you didn't have the lunar module for it, what can we do? What can we do, you know, to learn from the experience? Apollo 10, the near landing, similar situation of practicing everything you can up to the point of actually doing the mission. More questions? Good.
Yeah, had the Apollo program continued, how long could they have extended the stays on the moon with the current design?
In the J missions, which was the lunar module was get extra propellant, extra weight carrying capability. The last 3 missions were called the J missions, Apollo 15, 16, and 17. I don't believe that the plans were in place for any greater lunar module capabilities. We were pretty much, Mr. Ross corrects me, I think you were up against the 3-day stay was about the limit of that system without major rework.
I have the data here on Apollo 17, LEM 12. We stayed, the time that the LEM was on the surface is 74 hours, 59 minutes and 40 seconds. And the EVA, in which the 2 astronauts were actually on the surface, was 22 hours. Now that compared with on Apollo 11, LEM 5, 21 hours LEM time on the surface and 2 hours EVA duration. So we learned a lot in terms of expanding the worth of the mission. No.
The 18 and 19 LEMs were J missions before they were canceled, so that kind of answers your question. Next one.
If they'd extended the duration of the Apollo program time-wise, so say after Apollo, say 13, if instead of going about 2 to 3 a year, if they had done it, say 1 a year, could they have, how much cost would that have added to the program? And there would have
that's a very good question. It turns out, if you look at the missions after Apollo 13, they were much longer, on the order of 6 to 8 months, as opposed to the original plan, which was having 4 bay vehicle extremely building. They're building 4 Saturns. I don't think we ever got more than 2 Saturns in construction at one time in the vehicle assembly building. And also, if you remember from Apollo 13, the stages did not bang down together like it shows in that movie. I guarantee you it was a gentle fit when the stages, that was one thing in the movie that really shook me, but the rest of the movie was pretty good. But your question, we were already seeing that extension. We're already seeing the Vietnam War basically eating up everybody's spare budget. Really killing us. I believe myself, the Vietnam War and other interests was seeing, and the fact that when you stretch things out, you lose interest. Look at Jim Lovell and the fact he couldn't get his TV show shown there. We are in Apollo 16. When they got to the moon, when the lunar orbit had trouble with the antenna, they were planning Apollo 16 to be a really bang-up primetime TV show. But the antenna problem caused them to have to shift the thing into the dead periods. When you're working against a total consumables problem, and you can't say, well, maybe I shift just one day. No, that's not the way it works. You're working against the schedule that says, hey, that everything's there, and I need to get on with my job. But some sort of your question of stretching it out can be to the detriment, especially when you're talking to the public, being your supplier of the money. We lost it in there. I think myself, in '76, finding that there was not life on Mars, or maybe it wasn't, was a key epoch, a key period in the space program, in the space pursuits myself.
If I could pop back, could you have saved enough money from the year-to-year budgets that you might have been able to do, say, Apollo 18, 19, 20, and 21 in the late 70s?
That's not the way the government work doesn't work that way on saving money. The NASA budget's year by year, and you don't build up an account. That's the problem. I don't know how you do the budget, how you do the accounting on it.
And there never was a 21 in construction.
That's right. I'd like to say something about Apollo 13. As was mentioned, as a former Grummanite, I'd like to point out that having a Grumman guy in the flight control room was a fiction, a total fiction. NASA does not allow contractors in the flight control center during a mission. And when Fred Hayes, who was the L.E.M pilot on Apollo 13, asked the director of the movie, why did he do that? The only argument he could give was, look, I had to tell the audience who aren't space engineers what the L.E.M was doing beyond its original design capability. But a lot of us at Grumman feel the way he did it was insulting. The other point that was a fiction to some extent was the drama that was shown when the actual explosion in the service module took place. If you know, many of you have studied physics, you know with a small force and a large mass, you don't get much motion. Well, what they did was exaggerate the motion considerably, just as a form of Hollywood drama.
Banging together to stay That was a flat-out impressive elevator down there in that vehicle assembly building. A scary thing to ride in that baby.
In the movie, has it been mentioned that the L.E.M landing leg should have been shown deployed going around behind the moon? Because they had to do one burn.
It's talking about the legs, and I noticed minor things like that too. And it turns out, they also pointed out that he did not use the, whichever uses the guiding device to keep in the window was the opposite. Did he use the moon or the earth? Turns out in actuality it was the opposite of that. But they used a little poetic license, but it was overall, I think it instilled some new interest if we can use it. The question, is it already died away? We're living this back to my question of virtual reality. You know, we're seeing too much of that. We create special effects in movies, and instead of the real special effects, which we've sat glued to our television. We sat in college, we sat glued to our televisions watching the Ranger land crash into the moon. Okay, sat, and that's a group of college kids. They're doing that back in that time period. I don't know if we can regain that.
Was there ever any consideration to building a beefed up second or third stage to the Saturn V to turn it into a truly heavy lift cargo vehicle?
I have seen some concepts of only studies of strap-ons or strapping several Saturn V's together, but only studies, only phase A, pretty small money things.
Yeah, getting back to the movie Apollo 13, I tend to look at it as it did capture kind of the feeling of the time. And I kind of look at it as, hey, it did us some good. It was a good shot to the space program. It got the public a little interested for a change. And I look at it somewhat as, yeah, it wasn't all that historically accurate, but then it was somewhat like an impressionistic painting of the Apollo program by Ron Howard. And one other thing that wasn't covered in the movie at all was the towing bill that Grumman sent to Rockwell after it was clear that the ship was going to get down all right. It looked like it was all going to work out, and a number of very tired men, oh, we are running a little over. But they actually sent a towing bill, what was it, about 20 cents per mile for 500,000 miles?
I note that Apollo 13 is worth nitpicking the way The Right Stuff was not worth nitpicking. Where that movie just was making more myth on top of other myth.
You have to keep in mind, because I was watching the PBS special on tornadoes and all, or lightning a few weeks ago, and they said that Apollo 11 got hit by lightning. I said, oh, wait. So even they said 11. They said 11. It really was 12. And so even everybody's not good on their research. It's amazing sometimes how they're not good in going back and pulling out. You really have to be good at it to pull out the data. Any other questions? We've got. We've really enjoyed this. It's good to go back and relive. And
well, I'm sure informal questions, if the speakers are not overtired at this point, are appropriate. We've gone well over the time slot allotted. There isn't anything else going here, so it doesn't really matter. On the other hand, let's give these guys a break. They may be tired.